Okay, so hi everyone. Uh, I hope my audio is completely clear. Can you hear me? Just let me know in the chat box. Okay, great. So let us start the session today. Okay, this is your second last session of the Republic project. So today we'll be discussing for the first topic of today's session. It will be Indian secularism versus Western secularism. Okay, so if you want to understand the topic secularism, okay, it becomes absolutely necessary to compare the Indian model with the Western models of secularism, because without this comparison many misunderstandings arise. Okay, especially when students assume that secularism means the same thing everywhere in the world, whereas in reality the meaning, the structure, the application of secularism varies significantly and depending on the historical and cultural political context of each country. Now, the idea of secularism in India, as reflected in the preamble to the Constitution of India, is not a borrowed copy of Western secularism, okay, but rather it's a careful adapted version that responds to India's unique conditions. And therefore, understanding this difference is essential for any serious study of constitutional law. Now, to begin with, let us first understand what is generally meant by Western secularism, particularly in countries like France and United States, where the concept developed in response to specific historical struggles between the church and the state. So, in many Western countries, secularism emerged as a kind of reaction, okay, against the dominance of religious institutions, especially the church, which had significant control over the political power, the education, and the social life. And therefore, the primary goal of secularism in those contexts was to limit the influence of religion on the state and to ensure that the governance remains independent, of religious authority. Now, this led to the development of the principle of strict separation between the religion and the state, where the state does not interfere in religious matters, and religion does not interfere in state matters, creating a kind of clear boundary between the two. Now, if we carefully analyze this Western model, we can see that it operates on the assumption that religion and the state are the two distinct and potentially conflicting domains that must be kept apart in order to protect individual freedom and prevent the abuse of power. Okay, for example, if the state were to support a particular religion, you know it could lead to discrimination against those who do not follow that religion. And if religious institutions were to influence state decisions, it could undermine the democratic governance and the rule of law, and thereby, therefore, the solution adopted in many Western countries was to create a system where the religion is largely confined to private sphere, and public institutions operate independently of religious considerations. Now, however, when we turn to the Indian context, okay, we find that historical and social conditions are fundamentally different, which makes the direct application of the Western model both very impractical and undesirable. In India, the religion has never been a separate or isolated aspect of life. Rather, it is deeply integrated into the social, cultural, and even economic practices, influencing everything from personal laws and the family relations to the festivals, educations, and community life. So, therefore, if the Indian state were to adopt a model of strict separation and completely withdraw from all the religious matters, it would not only be unrealistic but could also lead to serious problems, particularly in relation to the social reform and the protection of the individual rights. Now let us just examine this thought, you know, kind of in a way of ifs and buts scenarios, because these help us understand the practical implications of different approaches. So if India were to follow a strict Western model of secularism, okay, where the state does not interfere in religion at all, then the practices that are discriminatory or oppressive, even if justified on religious grounds, might continue without any challenge, because the state would lack the authority to intervene. So, for instance, if certain religious customs violate the principles of equality or dignity, such as those affecting women or marginalized communities, the state would be unable to regulate or reform them, thereby allowing injustice to persist under the protection of religious freedom. So this would directly conflict with the constitutional commitment to equality and social justice. Now, on the other hand, okay, if the state were to go to the opposite extreme and completely control or dominate the religious institutions, it could suppress the religious freedom and autonomy, leading to resentment and resistance among the communities, and potentially creating a situation where the state is perceived as hostile to religion rather than neutral. Therefore, I think the Indian approach seeks to avoid both extremes by avoiding what is often described as a model of principled distance, where the state maintains a certain distance from all the religions but does not hesitate you know, to engage with them when necessary to uphold the constitutional values. Right. So the concern, you know, so what to say? The concept, sorry, the concept of the principled distance is central to the understanding Indian secularism, because it allows the state to treat different religions differently based on their specific circumstances, rather than applying a uniform rule of non-interference. For example, if a particular religious practice is found to be harmful or discriminatory, sorry, the state may intervene or to regulate or reform that practice, while in other cases it may choose to support or facilitate the religious activities that contribute to social welfare, such as education, charity, provided that such support is given in a non discriminatory manner. This thing is very important. This flexible approach recognizes that equality does not always mean identical treatment. Sometimes it requires just differential treatment to address specific issues and ensure fairness. Now, another important aspect of the Indian model is that it emphasizes equal respect for all religions rather than the exclusion of religion from the public life. This means that the state does not favor any particular religion, but it also does not treat religion, as something that must be completely removed from the public sphere. Instead, it does acknowledges the role of religion in the lives of citizens, and seeks to create a kind of framework in which different religious communities can coexist peacefully while respecting each other's rights. So, this approach is closely linked to the constitutional value of the fraternity, which promotes a sense of unity and mutual respect among citizens regardless of their religious identities. Now, at this point, it is very important to consider the role of judiciary in interpreting and applying the principle of secularism, because courts often play a very crucial role in resolving the disputes related to the religious freedom, state intervention, and the balance between different constitutional values. For example, courts may be called upon, okay, to determine whether a particular practice is an essential element of religion, okay, and whether it is protected under the constitution, or to decide whether the state action in relation to religion is justified and consistent with the principle of secularism. So these decisions are often complex and controversial, as they do involve not only legal analysis but also an understanding of religious traditions and social realities. Now, if we step back and if we look at the broader picture, we can say that the difference between the Indian and the Western secularism is not merely a matter of the definition, but reflects a deeper differences in historical experience, social structure, constitutional goals. While Western secularism emerged, as a response to the dominance of the religious institutions and seeks to limit their influence, the Indian secularism emerged in context of religious diversity and seeks to manage that diversity in a way that promotes unity, equality, and justice. So, therefore, the Indian model is not about separating religion and state in absolute sense, but about ensuring that the relationship between them is guided by constitutional principles and serves the larger goals of the society. So, we can say this thing that the comparison between the Indian and the Western secularism highlights the importance of context in constitutional design, because principles that work in one setting may not be suitable for another, and the success of any model depends on how well it addresses the specific challenges and needs of the society in which it operates. So, the Indian approach, with its emphasis on equal respect, principled distance, and constitutional values, represents a kind of attempt to create a balanced and inclusive framework that accommodates diversity while safeguarding fundamental rights. And it continues to evolve as new challenges and questions arise in the ever changing landscape of Indian society. Okay, is this clear